And joining us now on the debate in Montreal, Quebec, Will Falk, Executive Fellow in Residence at the Mowat Centre. In our nation's capital, Don Drummond, Chair of the Commission on the Reform of Ontario's Public Services. And with us here in studio, Ben Levin, former Deputy Minister of Education for the provinces of Ontario and Manitoba, Terry O'Leary, advisor to then former Finance Minister Paul Martin, and Martin Redcon, who's Queen's Park columnist at the Toronto Star. And we're happy to have everybody around this table and to our guests in Points Beyond. I want to start by just getting, Terry, I'll put you to work first here. We want to get a better understanding of why, federally, Jim Flaherty, the finance minister, is now saying, sorry, we can't balance our budget in this next mandate as we had promised. And in the province of Ontario, it doesn't appear as if the McGuinty government is going to make its original target either. How come?
Well, I think you're seeing the full thrust of the international economic situation hit our shores. It's treacherous times right now, and I think for those both on the federal government side and the provincial government side, they're carrying two burdens. One is the deficit burden that has been a challenge for quite some time, but also a growth burden. And I think you're seeing them trying to navigate their way through some really difficult period of time right now. And balancing the need to eliminate the deficit and get it down into sustainable terms, and also being able to have growth in the economy, is going to be a real challenge for both levels of government going forward.
Don Drummond, on this twin challenge, you told Karen Hallett of the Globe and Mail this just a few days ago, and I'll quote you back to you. The Ontario government will not meet its target to erase the province's multi-billion-dollar deficit by fiscal 2018 unless it caps the growth rate in spending on healthcare, education, and other programs at 1% a year for the next 6 years, according to former TD Bank economist Don Drummond, who has been appointed by the government to review program spending. Why do you think, Don, that 1% a year for 6 years is what it takes to get the books balanced?
Yeah, so first I'd like to rephrase the way you opened it. The federal government said that they won't make the target they put in the budget. No one in Ontario has given up, and certainly I haven't given up. So at the time of the budget, they took the revenues that they thought would be generated from the economic assumptions, the interest, calculate the interest on the public debt, set an anchor and balance in 2017. So program spending literally became a residual. And at the time of the budget, they calculated that the program spending would have to grow no more than 1.4%. With the additional weakness in the economy that Terry O'Leary just spoke about, I would calculate that 1.4% has to come down to 1%. A pretty stringent requirement, but they could keep to the balanced budget by 2017 if they kept the program spending growing that little.
Well, you say stringent, Don, but maybe a better word would be unprecedented? Hold spending to 1% a year for 8 years?
Well, there's one precedent. It would be Roy Romano in Saskatchewan in the early 1990s. The Klein administration, a couple of years later, came close to that. They had almost that much restraint for a little bit shorter period of time. The experience that Ontarians would be more familiar with, we had that depth of restraint in Ontario, but not for that long period. And the same thing for the federal government in the mid-1990s. They actually had a steeper cut in program spending for a while, but the restraint did not last for 7 years. So it's not so much the severity of the restraint at any given moment, it's more the duration that makes it almost unprecedented. Not quite, thanks to Roy Romano.
Okay, let's, Martin, talk about the politics of all this. Healthcare spending, we know, traditionally goes up anywhere from, now admittedly last year only 3%, but usually it's 5, 6, 7, 8% a year. The politics of trying, particularly in a minority parliament, of trying to hold the line on spending to 1% a year for the next 6, 7, 8 years. Talk to us about that.
Well, I think 1 would be impossible. What I think they want to do is try to bring it down to 3 or so, but that's still not as easy as it sounds. If it's about 8% on average and you go down to 3, that's half of what you've had for the last several years. I'm an old guy. I've seen politicians going back decades try to promise to rein in health spending and then pay the price for it, because whenever the party that is in power fails in that promise and then itself goes into opposition, progressive conservatives, liberals, and so on, they then change positions. It's all going around in circles, and the people in opposition squawk about hospitals being cut or jails being closed, for that matter, any other government program that people consider sacred. So the politics are frankly ugly. It will be, Canadians and Ontarians hold their health care dear. And even if they cut it down to 3% for health and about 1% for education, that will mean even bigger cuts for everything else. Substantial cuts, so over 10% perhaps in other areas, and people have to be prepared for that as well.
Ben, you've been a Deputy Minister of Education, so take us inside that file and tell us, what does that mean, holding the line on education spending to 1% a year?
Well, essentially the education budget similar to the health budget, is almost all salaries. It's about 85% salaries. So if you want to change the expenditure curve, then you either have to have fewer people, or you have to pay them less, or you have to get more productivity by changing the way you use the resources you have. Those are your options.
You know, they usually say there are good options and bad options. It sounds like in this case, there are bad options and worse options. Is that a fair way to put it?
Not necessarily. I actually think there are some things we could do in education that would move the cost curve that would actually be educationally sound, as opposed to the we'll cut. There are some things we could do in a positive way that would cost less money and actually be better.
You went through all this in the 1990s, Terry, when you were beside Paul Martin as he was trying to balance budgets that were wildly out of whack. What does 1% mean?
It's hard politics. It's absolutely, as Martin has just said, very difficult politics. And as Don Drummond knows, who was by my side during that period of time, the only way that you can do it with a political resolve that is the #1 goal of the government. Now, in '93, we were facing a very different situation because we literally did have a debt crisis on our hands. And we were coming out of a recession. We did have some growth in the economy, but we hadn't balanced budgets for 25 years in this country, and it was a real problem that the federal government had to deal with. But no envelope of spending was left untouched. We cut transfers to provinces. They were very difficult cuts to make, but we cut every other aspect of government spending at the same time. And as a result, the people really were able to hold forth with that deficit reduction plan because no government spending envelope was spared. Having said that, one of the first places that we reinvested money back into was health and education. But it is a really difficult choice, and you know, at both the provincial and federal level now, you're facing a different problem, and that is you've got no growth. You've got an economic restructuring happening in North America and Europe that is unprecedented, and it's really exacerbating the problem at both the federal and provincial level.
Will, let me get you into this discussion at this point and ask you, since healthcare is your area of expertise, give us a greater understanding of what it means to take healthcare spending, which for years routinely went up 5, 6, 7%, and take it down to 1%, which is what Don Drummond is advocating, for the next 6, 7, 8 years. What does that mean?
Sure, Steve. I'll echo a couple of things that Ben said. I think that there are opportunities in healthcare as there are in education. We've seen these cycles before, and the cycles do present us with an opportunity to take a new look at some of the fundamental areas. We've made big investments over the last decade, and there are areas that we can take some costs out now and take spending down.
Give me an example.
MD compensation. We've had physicians that have seen incomes go up dramatically over the last decade because of investments that we've made in technology, diagnostic imaging, cataract surgery, endoscopy. I could list another half a dozen areas where the technology has caused us to be able to do much greater volumes than we have been in the past, but we haven't had the courage yet to take the fee levels down and to rationalize the fee levels. Similarly, on the hospital side, we need to complete the move that we began as early as the 80s and 90s towards ambulatory clinics. Some of those are really tough decisions, as the move to outpatient was in the 90s. But tough times call for tough decisions, and it's only if we push on some of these issues that we'll know how far we can get.
Okay, tough times call for tough decisions. And Martin, I want you to take a look back at the 8 years that Dalton McGuinty has been Premier and tell me whether you see a track record of a guy who can go to Ontario's doctors and say, I know you guys are routinely used to getting X% increases every time we do fee schedule negotiations. Well, it's going to be 1% a year for the next 8 years.
Well, past performance is not necessarily an indication of future performance or behavior. We know that from the markets and probably in government too. I think while the trend line has been to spend a lot of money under the McGuinty years, one of the reasons that perhaps Mr. Drummond will say he did that was there was a lot of pent-up demand because of the cutbacks in the previous Harris years and under Ernie Eves. That's one thing for spending jumping so fast. Electricity infrastructure, for example, was starved under the Harris years, and so there was again a rebound, as it were. Secondly, if I were dealing with the doctors, I would say, as I think he has already indicated, you did have a decent increase in the last few years. I forget the percentage, but they didn't reopen the contract a la other governments. They kept it where it was while others were being reined in a little bit, and I think now the argument will be it's the doctor's turn to take a bit of a hit, or a big hit, and make up for what they got in the last few years, in addition to the arguments we've just heard about technology changing. The political lay of the land has changed, though, because it is a minority government. You know, when Mr. Drummond was appointed in the last budget, two things were quite different. One is that budget was called Turning the Corner. Well, now we've gone all the way around the block, and we're back almost where we started in terms of the economy, because the rug has been pulled out from under us. So economic circumstances have changed, and timing is everything in politics, but also in economics. And this may be a tough time for a restraint regime. But secondly, you have the opposition dynamic, and will the opposition play ball? That's something we can discuss more.
Don Drummond, do you have a good sense that, I mean, it's one thing to task you with making a roadmap to get us from here to there. Do you have the confidence that the current government of Ontario, given that it's in a minority parliament situation, has both the strength and the ability to massage its way through a minority parliament in order to make the decisions it needs to get this done?
I think so. First of all parties during the election did agree with balancing the budget no later than 2017 and 18. And the second reason also takes me back. The task I've been given and the task I am trying to perform is way more complicated than we've discussed so far. If it was just a question of dollars and cents and keeping to that 1%, I would have been finished months ago. We also have to bring in the quality of public services. It's what you're getting for the money is just as important. Yeah. And I would say in most cases we could be getting more. And we have to look at the level of spending, not just the growth rate. So we spend an awful lot on healthcare, not as it's been going up, but the level's really high. It's almost 12% of our gross domestic product, which put it as amongst the most expensive systems in the world next to the United States. I don't want to take this too far, but an OECD study suggested that if we benchmarked our system against the most efficient systems in Europe, we would spend 2.5% of GDP less. Will gave a couple of examples of that. Last year, the Ontario government did take on generic drug prices. That saved hundreds of millions of dollars. 1% of all the people in Ontario account for almost half of healthcare spending. Now, that's always going to be skewed, but a classic example is your release from a hospital for congestive heart failure into a vacuum. Nobody tracks you. We know that your probability of being readmitted is reduced by more than a quarter if you're visited by a nurse within 24 hours. That often doesn't happen. So you're always, and this is what I'm constantly dealing with, how do you bring in the quality part of it? It's not just a question of cutting the money, because that's what led to these problems in the 1990s, where the problems just blew up in your face again.
And we understand that, and Will, okay, Will, you wanted to follow up on that, I can hear.
Yeah, I want to link the two comments that Don and Martin made. You know, I do think that the Bill 102 example in the drug pricing is a great example where, you know, Deb Matthews really showed some courage and took on some entrenched interests.
The pharmacists
that kind
in
of
that
taking
case.
on, well, yes, and also in organizing the drug system. She did a great job on that. I think it's that kind of courage that we're going to need going forward. Don's example of chronic disease management is a perfect one. If we get ahead of this, this is an opportunity to really do system transformation and do it the right way. What we don't want to do here is wait until the crisis of the magnitude that Terry spoke about earlier comes over us, and then we'll be forced to do across-the-board cuts a la Harris. If we get out ahead of this and do some thoughtful stuff, make the investments in chronic disease, make the investments in the value-added clinics, and finish off the digitization stuff that we've started in the last 10 years, I think there's plenty of opportunity to take down costs.
Okay, but that's all well and good on the healthcare. Stand by 1 second, Will, because that's all well and good on the healthcare reform side. But Terry, I want you to talk about the brass knuckle politics on this. Again, I can just imagine the government's negotiators going to the Ontario Medical Association, which may be the most powerful lobby group in this whole province, and says to them, you guys have done well by us over the last decade. It's time for you to just temper your demands and maybe take fee reductions for some of the services that you do, the way Will just described. I mean, how do you imagine that message is going to go over?
Well, it won't go over well, but I mean, one of the things that's going to have to be outlined, and somebody like Premier McGuinty has the political capital to do that, is the shared sacrifice that's going to be required to go forward. And I think on healthcare and education especially, you have a Premier who most Ontarians trust his value judgment and how much faith he places in that systems and how important that is to people in Ontario. So you actually have a situation where you have somebody with a lot of political capital that if he wanted to invest himself in the reforms that Ben and Will have talked about and Don have talked about, that there is an opening for that discussion to take place.
You think so? I mean,
I do think
63%
so, yeah.
of the people, of the 50% of the people 49% of the people who voted against this guy. You think he's got this grand mandate to do this?
It's not so much a mandate, it's the conversation that has to take place. It's going to take place whether we like it or not. When we've got, you know, we're running up against a very vulnerable fiscal situation in Ontario that's been with us for a long time. Plus we have the debt, plus we have the restructuring aspect that's happening internationally. We are volatile as a result of having those high debt levels and not having done the reform. So there's a real opportunity to go forward. It's going to be tough, don't get me wrong, but nothing is going to be easy in the next 3 or 4 years going forward.
Let me hear Ben and then Will on this.
Well, one thing I'd say is that the more it's framed in terms of who's going to sacrifice what, the tougher the political conversation will be. So it's important to look for places where there can be win-win. And if you think in terms of teachers and collective bargaining with teachers, that's one of the biggest groups in the whole labor force, then the trick is to try to find, as Gerard Kennedy, you know, once said, to try to find things that they want to have that we want them to have. So, and there are examples of that. So when we negotiated the 2004-5 agreements with secondary teachers in Ontario, we created positions for student success teachers. The union liked it because it created additional teaching positions, but it actually helped many, many hundreds of thousands of kids graduate. And every kid who graduates in 4 years instead of 5 years is $10,000 less in education spending. So there are ways, I think, where we can think about how we could combine the interests of the professional groups with greater efficiency in the system. Not a ton of them, but there are some, and that's one place I'd go.
Will.
Sure, I agree with Ben. We've got to look for the innovative solutions. I mean, Steve, at this point, we don't let doctors use the telephone to talk to their patients. We don't let them do email to talk to their patients. Those are areas where we could easily change the system dramatically and use those well-established systems to do much better chronic disease management, for example. By modernizing and thinking ahead on some of these pieces, we can move beyond the old fee-for-service mentality and move to much more of an outcomes-based system that's going to be better for both the clinicians who are practicing and the patients. And I think in the long run cost a lot less. The question in the early years here is going to be how we get enough out in the first couple of years to pay for those investments in chronic disease management and better integrated care. But that's going to be a challenge. That's going to be a real challenge, and that may just involve some short-term losses. The good news is that we have had a decade of increases, and there should be some of those short-term gains that can be taken. We do need to do both, though. We need to be making the short-term cuts to pay our bills while we're thinking about what the big questions on system restructuring are, and get ahead of those system restructuring issues so that we don't get backed into a corner in years 3 and 4.
Martin.
Transitions are an important point here, and I think this is a fantastic thought experiment that Don Drummond is undertaking, and it makes for a great panel discussion because you have all these big ideas that you can throw about. And so far, we've spent most of our time discussing health and education because that's what Mr. Drummond is spending most of his time on.
That's where the money is.
44% of the budget for health and about 26 or so for education, plus or minus. But that means that the other 30% or so has to carry the freight for the next few years. And I do think that there is a lot of, I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit, but some big opportunities in health and education because they're thinking of some big transformations here. But in other areas like penitentiaries or, I don't know, road paving or other sort of bread and butter parts of the government, it's going to be hard to squeeze a lot of savings out there unless Don has a few other tricks up his sleeve. I'm sure he does. But still, that's a lot of money to generate from the rest of government, and I don't know how transformational he can be in those other areas. I wish him luck.
Got any other tricks up your sleeve?
Yeah, well, let's talk about this. I mean, first of all, let's talk about the aspiration. My aspiration for Ontario government, for the people of Ontario, is the public service here should be the best in the world. And you might think that's going out a long way. First of all, I'll point out, as we see week by week, the rest of the world's not that good. So if you want to pick to be number one, pick a weak field. But we have the best educated workforce in the world in Ontario, and it's getting better by the day. And the government set out objectives to improve that. So why wouldn't we have the best public service? A lot of it's heavy duty, big thinking and policy. A lot of it's just delivering service. It's almost mechanical. We do not benchmark well anywhere in Canada against the most efficient private sector operators and public operators. Again, you can improve that without hurting anybody. We have over a dozen income tested programs on social welfare in Ontario. They almost all have a separate administrator doing the test. They have different definitions of income. They have different periodicity. How in the world anybody would know how the rules are and how they apply them is beyond me. You can address all of that stuff and again, hopefully improve the service. Virtually every one of those programs has a separate employment and training function. Plus we have federal government employment trainers. Plus we have municipal training and employment. We have immigration language services operated by the 3 different levels of government. All of this stuff you can look at, and I'm convinced that you could substantially improve the efficiency. No, that won't get you all the way. I'm not trying to shove it under the carpet and think there won't be some pain, but I think you can really mitigate the pain by driving the efficiency, not just to make it better, but to make it the best in the world. We should accept nothing less than that.
Don, just curious, I gather the provincial finance minister is going to, Martin, what, 1 week today?
I think it's tomorrow.
1 week tomorrow.
It's Thursday. Next Thursday, is it? Perhaps?
I think next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, he's going to reveal the state of the books. The last we heard was first going to be 16 billion, then 15, and now probably, do you know what the number is going to be now?
I don't, in some sense, whether it's changed by $1 billion or not, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is that somewhere around that 14 to 16 billion, but the more important thing, left to its own devices, it will not go down. We've absolutely got to get that program spending number down. Obviously, it can go down to some degree, but not disappear if it's not quite down as low as the 1%. But you know, balancing it by 2017, that's still a long ways away. So regardless of what the number is, that's where we got to get, and there's no way around. And even fairly significant changes in the economy really don't change that 1% growth rate. This is that back in the budget with quite different economic assumptions, the program spending growth was 1.4, and for all the months I spent looking at that, I only changed the number from 1.4 to 1. Unfortunately, it's fairly robust. That is the sandbox that we have to play in.
I want to go to the history on this, though, and Terry, bring you in again. When you went through this massive deficit reduction exercise back in the mid-1990s with Paul Martin, there is the tendency, I guess, for politicians to want to make a clarion call to the patriotism of all of those who receive government money by saying, come on, kids, we got to take one for the team here. Everybody's just got to temper their demands or we're never going to get to balance. Whether it's doctors, whether it's teachers, whether it's people who teach in universities, you know, nurses, there are a lot of people whose checks are signed by the Finance Minister of Ontario. How do you make the case when everybody's looking out to cover their you-know-what and protect their you-know-what, that everybody's got to share some pain here in order to get to balance? How do you really make that case? Well, that's for Terry. Sorry, Don, that's for Terry.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Well, it's a tough job to do, but the communication of your effort on this front is going to actually be very important. One of the things you have to do is you have to cut yourself. Government spending can't be escaped from this. If you're going to have an austerity program and try to look like you're actually looking for cost savings, then you have to make sure that you're actually hurting yourself as well. And that means that the public service is not immune from that. But it means that you have to apply a degree of fairness to all of this as well. You have to recognize that the most vulnerable are not going to be able to maintain those cuts. And it's a communication exercise at every level, and it has to be taken from the very top. Your cabinet has to be behind it, the caucus has to be behind it. In this minority government scenario, you're going to have discussions with the other parties, and you're going to have to come to consensus about where to go forward. The smartest thing the government's done is commissioning Don's report, because at least you're going to have a fact basis on which to assess your program spending going forward. And like I said before, on health and education, which are the two most important priorities for for the Premier, but also for people in Ontario, you at least have a shared common sense of values. So the reforms that Ben and Will are talking about can find common cause in a common effort of shared sacrifice if everybody feels that they're part of it. But it's very difficult. Like, you can't underestimate how tough it is. But there's going to be, as Don said before, there's going to be no other cause. You can't just let the status quo stay where it is. The change is going to have to come. So you have to decide how you're going to make that change work for you.
Okay, we've talked, Ben, specifics in healthcare. Now let's go to education. Talk specifics there, because that's your area. I'm wondering if teachers who were accustomed to getting 3% a year salary increases for quite some time, if not more, 10, 20 years ago, how will it work when the government goes to them and says, we have to freeze your salaries for the next 6 years?
Well, if that's the only conversation, it's going to be very, very difficult and contentious. And my argument is we have to talk with teachers or with any other group about, yes, we have less money for salary increase, but maybe there are other ways that we can actually make your work more satisfying that do not involve spending more money. And I think there are those.
There are those ways?
Yes. Let me give an example.
Give us one example.
Sure. Will talked about telephones, but in fact, teachers are a group of professionals who don't have access to telephones in their workplace. They must be the only professionals who don't have telephones where they work and have to go down the hall to use the telephone. So just giving access teachers some of those tools. Let me give another one. The most important working condition for any teacher is who is your principal. But by and large, teachers don't have any voice in who principals are. So maybe there's an area where we could have some teacher involvement in the selection of principals, which is a trade-off teachers might take as a working condition issue over salary.
Well, let's say there are a dozen, for lack of a better expression, good ideas like that, which don't cost a heck of a lot, but which would go some distance to making teachers happier. Do they care more about those, based on your experience? Do they care more about those, or do they want that 3% a year?
Well, I think the evidence, the international evidence on teachers is that to recruit, keep good people in teaching, you need to pay teachers at about the level of other college graduates, right? With people with similar levels of education and aspiration. And we're pretty much on that in Ontario today. So while I don't think there's a lot of room, I think there would be real impact if we tried to reduce salaries. I think there is room to talk about other ways in which we could make the occupation more satisfying. Because one thing we know about teachers, they don't go into the job for the money. So yes, they need to be paid adequately. People need to be able to afford a mortgage, look after their kids, but they're more concerned about how satisfying the work is. And I would say the same about public servants, having been a public servant. There are many things we could do to make the lives of public servants better that don't necessarily involve paying them more.
That may be the case for teachers, Martin, but my hunch is the teacher union leaders will still be interested in that 3-year contract that goes up 3% a year. When the Premier goes to them and says, we got nothing for you for the next 3 years, how's that going to go down?
Not well, I think you're right, but I think everyone recognizes that the ground has shifted. I think Ben has made a couple of good points. I've learned, for example, that teachers are similar to journalists. We also don't go in it for the money. The second thing is that teachers do care about principals, because my kids' school had a bit of a revolt over their principal over the last year or so. So I do think that's an interesting way to go at things.
So you want the kids to have a say in who chooses the
principal?
principal?
Well, there's an idea,
For sure. Absolutely.
Really?
Yes.
But look, that's never going to be an easy sell. And even when the teachers were given, help me out, Ben, I think 3 or 4% over 4 years in the last contract, which is, I think, a pretty generous contract, even that didn't go down easily. And there was a lot of trouble with the elementary school teachers union, I believe.
2 and 2.
And they weren't happy with that either. So there will be diminishing returns. So can't deny it'll be contentious. I think the other question, though, is what will be the political lay of the land? That will be what's animating Mr. McGuinty at the end of the day. First of all, he can say to the teachers he's given them a pretty good ride for the last few years. There have been no strikes since the Harris era that I'm aware of in the main.
Just in post-secondary. York University had the longest one ever.
Oh, yes.
But at the elementary and secondary level, he had not a single day lost.
And York was ugly, for sure. Special case there, I think. But remember also, when Don Drummond's report was commissioned, not only was the economy different, but the political lay of the land was different. It was a majority government and a reasonable prospect of another majority government. And so how the NDP and the Conservatives will deal with Mr. Drummond's recommendations is very interesting. I think it's fair to say that the Tories will be more sympathetic, given that they were proposing similar kinds of budget cuts, not as perhaps involved as Mr. Drummond's or as much reform as Mr. Drummond had in mind, but the numbers probably line up fairly similarly. For the NDP, it's a different game, and I think they have more of an agenda with Mr. Drummond on corporate tax cuts, for example. And I think they are positioning themselves, we're already seeing, as being the sort of fighting for the little guy in affordability and not really buying into the cuts as yet. We'll see.
Well, Will, that's a good point. What happens when the NDP, for example, say to the Premier, you're not going to get any of our votes in the legislature unless you raise corporate taxes to pay for the additional health care services that we want to have and the higher salaries for nurses and orderlies and so on and so forth. What should the answer be?
Well, Steve, let's put it in context, though, right? I mean, we've seen dramatic moves, look, there are others on this panel who know more about politics than I'm ever going to, but we've seen dramatic moves in Europe, and we're not talking about social contract and -4%. We're talking about flatlining people in a time when private sector wages have been flat and declining. I don't think that this, back to Terry's point, I don't think there's a problem with Dalton McGuinty, who has a lot of credibility on health and education, coming out and saying, look, this is a shared sacrifice point. We're not even asking you to take a rollback on the wages. Let's move forward here and be thoughtful about this, but really we can't afford to see growth for the next few years. I think the guy's got credibility. I don't see where the opposition parties go on that.
Well,
I mean, it doesn't strike me as tenable to say, oh no, we think you should be spending more on this at this point in salaries.
Let me try this with Don.
Yeah.
Don, I don't have to remind you, I think it was 20 years ago that Bob Rae, whose party in government had a lot of support among the public and private sector unions of this province, and yet he went to them and said, everybody's going to have to take a bit of a haircut here. It's called the social contract, but it'll be shared sacrifice, and we'll turn an $11 billion deficit on a budget that was, what, less than half the size of this one, into a balanced budget someday. And they all screamed bloody murder and said, no way, we're not going to do it. So that call for shared sacrifice, even if you've got credibility with your stakeholders, I mean, doesn't your experience tell you that most often than not is going to go nowhere?
First of all, I just want to clarify one thing. When you've all been speaking about various different collective bargaining increases, you've been talking about the increases in the base wages. Most of those contracts have fairly automatic movement through the grade, so when you refer to 3%, the annual wage increase is typically quite a bit above that because there's additions to the movement through the grade for that. But again, I come back to my point. It's not so much about the actual compensation, whether it's 0 or some modest percent. Obviously, it can't be very large, or you're never going to get the 1% program. But there's a lot more at stake. So by 2017 and before that, you've got to have your eye on the end game. You want an extraordinarily competent civil service working very efficiently. And wages are part of it, but as Ben and others have said, there's a lot more to it than that. And it has to be a cooperative arrangement to go that. I don't think anybody's talking about rolling back wages. First of all, while governments did slap wage freezes and the like in 1990s, we've had 2 very clear Supreme Court decisions in Canada saying you can't wake up one day and just do a wage freeze. It's not what you would want to start off at any rate, but you have to go through due process. And I think the public service workers have a strong, very pride, and they want to deliver the best quality, and in many cases they're impeded to do so in an inefficient structure, and I think that they can be very much part of that to make the structure efficient. And obviously that would accomplish at some point, maybe not in the next couple of years, some kind of wage increase. It's all about productivity. We don't measure productivity in civil services anywhere, and we don't reward on that basis, and that's one of the changes we should bring into play, and that would give them some vested interest in participating.
Terry, I don't want to be a killjoy here, but you've said it yourself at the earlier in our discussion that one of the ways you helped balance the books in the mid-1990s was to cut the transfers that the federal government made to the provinces. Often what has happened in the past in Ontario or in other provinces that they cut their transfers to municipalities, except that this Premier and this government has already promised to further upload $1.5 billion of money they were going to, that had already been downloaded. So that option doesn't appear to be there. They really seem squeezed between, bad options and worse options right now. Again, not trying to sound like a killjoy, but where does anybody get the confidence that this is actually going to happen here?
Well, because the options are so limited and the times are so tough. I mean, you know, people are feeling really bruised here. I mean, when we're talking about, you know, the public sector wage increases and status quo, I mean, you're right now, you're lucky if you've got a safe and secure job. A lot of people are really being hard hit. Change is coming, and whether that change is going to be a positive in the medium and long term, whether it's going to allow for us to make investments in growth and try to restructure where we're going on healthcare and education, that time is upon us right now.
Okay.
Nobody would have wished us to be caught in this situation, but we are, and so we're going to have to face this reality. I don't think there's any other choice.
We're going to have to face this reality, says you, and yet Premier McGuinty on Tuesday afternoon gave a speech at the Economic Club of Canada at which he was handing out, excuse me, not he, but OPSU was handing out, where's Kevin? Over here, sorry. OPSU, the Public Service Employees Union, was handing out in the parking lot before the speech, Ontario has a big problem, the economy isn't working for people, and then there's the litany of issues. Dalton McGuinty's response, cut jobs and services to pay off the deficit. I mean, the marker is already being laid down, Ben, to say, don't cut our salaries. You can balance the books, by all means. Knock yourself out, but don't touch my pay.
Sure. And that's why I think framing it in terms of cuts is going to be a very difficult way to do it, as opposed to, as Don said, thinking about productivity. So let me take another education example. We spend more in secondary education than we used to, but our high school graduation rate has gone up from 68% to 81%. There's a big productivity saving in doing that. There's a lot of kids who don't need a 5th year of high school now because they're graduating in 4. There's still a lot of kids, though, who do need a 5th year of high school, and if we could get more kids graduating on time, we would have a better system that costs less money, plus there are benefits to that down the road because those kids are more employable and so on and so forth, right? So that's where I think the discussion has to be, at least in education and in health, around how do we increase productivity without doing it by saying to teachers, it's all on your backs, you just have to work harder for the same pay. That's not going to be a winning argument.
Martin, let me just ask you whether you think the $1.5 billion of uploading that the government promised before it knew that the situation was worse, is any of that in jeopardy?
I can't predict, but I would say not. I think they made a big issue of how Mr. Hudak would not make that promise, and I think Mr. McGuinty is committed. Let me just say, though, that we've talked a lot about the deficit at $16 billion, but no one ever talks about the debt, the cumulative deficit over the years, which sits at about $240 billion, which is roughly 2 years' worth of Ontario's budget. We could have 2 years of budgets now without having to pay raise any taxes if we had that kind of a surplus. So that debt keeps getting bigger and bigger and will continue to get bigger even if we shrink that deficit until 2018. That's one incentive. On the other side, people don't really care about the deficit. When you test in polls, at public opinion polling, it's way down below healthcare, education, jobs, taxes, and so on. So getting people motivated is going to be a big challenge for Mr. Drummond and for Mr. Duncan, the treasurer, if this keeps up.
I want to give the last 20 seconds to Don Drummond, and I want you, Don, to say the same thing you did last week when we had you on, when you talked about Ontario and Greece a decade ago and what the debt to GDP ratio was as a cautionary tale. Go ahead.
Funny you should say that, because when Martin was giving the debt numbers, that's exactly what I was thinking. So what I said was, when did Greece have Ontario's current debt ratio? And you might think it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, so in fact it was 1984. When did Italy and Portugal and Ireland and all the rest of the fiscal basket cases have Ontario's debt level? Well, they were all somewhere between the early to the mid-1990s. I don't want to over-dramatize that. Doesn't say there's a given course, but it shows these things can slip away on you pretty darn quickly. And these are almost irretrievable now at the debt levels that they're talking about. So there's a parallel in history, albeit some 15 to 20 years displaced, but we got to ensure that that parallel stops there. That's the end of the road.
Gotcha. Thanks, everybody, for coming on the program today. Don Drummond from our Ottawa studios, Chair of the Commission on Reform of Ontario's Public Services. Will Falk, the fellow at the Mowat Centre in Toronto. We had him on the line from Montreal, Quebec. Here in our studios, Terry O'Leary, the former Chief of Staff to Finance Minister Paul Martin. Ben Levin, former Deputy Minister of Education for Ontario, Manitoba. Martin Regcon, Queen's Park columnist, Toronto Star. Thanks, everybody.